Trump doesn't like long wars. In fact, he doesn't like wars altogether very much. He has initiated on the part of America very, very few military operations initiated, continued with others, particularly the surveillance in Syria and so on in his first presidency. But, this time round, it's the bombing of the Houthis, which has now stopped, and they have got a truce. He quite clearly didn't want to go for an all-out bombing campaign against Iran alongside the Israelis. He does not like the prospect of a war in Ukraine or in and around the eastern borders of Europe and the western borders of Asia, namely what we're seeing now. And that instability, it's not of primary importance to Trump, but it's of secondary importance. And the longer it goes on, the longer it becomes a nuisance. It unbalances his objectives for all kinds of things of acquisition of territory, but particularly assets in the Arctic and so on. So the absolutely crazy is a fairly typical off-the-cuff remark by Trump. It's typical Trump vocabulary, but it does, his dislike of needless killing is absolutely marked, and that is consistent. And I wonder if Putin fully realizes it. I tell you that Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel is beginning to learn quite directly how Trump dislikes the indiscriminate killing of civilians.
Don't you think that Putin could overplay his hand by delaying negotiations and by just taping Donald Trump along, pretending to would like to have a ceasefire deal by just continuing his war against Ukraine? And could this also trigger more anger from Donald Trump and other actions in support for Ukraine?
Well, I think we've got about a month to learn about this, because I think Trump will actually say what he wants and how he sees security for Ukraine, for Eastern Europe, and dealing with Russia if and when he goes to the NATO summit in The Hague on the 24th of June. It's not clear that he will go, but he should go because he wants a redesign of NATO. And his terms are clear. He wants wealthy European allies to do far, far more in their own defense. Well, if they discuss that in The Hague, then they must discuss a rolling plan. And this is what Poland, Finland, Germany, France, certainly Italy too, and Britain and the Nordic countries will want, because they must then work out what their architecture is going to be. But a reduction of presence, particularly of ground troops in Europe, is absolutely clearly on the cards. We've been told so by the Deputy Defense Secretary, Hegseth's deputy, Elbridge Colby, seems to be doing more of the policy driving, more of the policy thinking. And he has warned the allies that this is going to happen. But it doesn't mean to say giving up on Ukraine necessarily. Trump has a soft spot for Putin. We want to know more about that. I personally want to know why. Is it personal? Is it to do with money? What is going on? Because he's very light in criticizing Putin. He has been very light in imposing sanctions and imposing tariffs. No tariffs on Russia, although it's under sanction. Enormous tariffs on China, and now enormous tariffs on the EU, 50% declared. So how is all this going to come out? I think a lot now hangs on the European leadership. And although they seem to have their difficulties and their money troubles, I think Merz, Macron, and Giorgia Meloni even, quite an ally of Russia hitherto, will really have strong things to say, and they will drag the others, like the Brits, along with them. But it's peculiarly small powers that seem to have very strong voices and powerful figures that are going to be important. Who could have thought, even 2 years ago, that figure like Kaya Kallas, now the foreign affairs spokeswoman and high commissioner for foreign affairs in the EU, would have such an incisive voice. She can make people listen to her, and she's saying, "Look, if we don't then defend Ukraine now, we're next." The Baltic countries and the Finns, and she's got the message across. And I think that that's why Putin may overreach himself, because it's the kind of coalition politics he doesn't like, which we see in Europe, and it's the kind of coalition politics of advanced countries, very civilized, sophisticated nations, he simply doesn't understand.
Why does Donald Trump hate wars?
I think it's quite interesting, because it's part of his whole personality, because he's a performer, he's a creature of the moment, and wars take a lot of time. They take a lot of planning, by the way, which he's not over good at. And I think it's because he likes the showy art of the deal. You can go, you can embrace Mohammed bin Salman. And by the way, the deals that he has done in Abu Dhabi and in Riyadh are of fundamental importance in the contest in advanced technology, in computing, in hypersonics and quantum, that they're now toe-to-toe with. It's a big contest with China. And those allies in Saudi Arabia and the UAE are absolutely vital for America keeping ahead. They need the capacity, they need the power, they need the money, they need the ability to generate just that amount of electrical power, which you cannot do through any installations and formations and networks currently in the United States. All these things are very important. And in the way that they have to consider that for the way that they will compete with China over the next 30, 40 years, long, grinding wars, uncertain wars, which may have come if you had had an outright bombing campaign against Iran, that's not so interesting. It carries too much risk, no guarantee of a positive result.
And let's cover our final topic. The New York Times reported about the preparations for NATO summit in Hague. However, there is interesting work toward the involvement of President Zelensky in this program. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and other leaders, they are afraid of the possibility of direct clash between President Zelensky and US President Donald Trump. Also, Wall Street Journal reported that Trump has been hesitating to impose sanctions on Russia because he dislikes President Zelensky. How do you see the main reasons behind this Trump's stance on President Zelensky? Why does he dislike Ukrainian president?
He's everything that Trump isn't. He's a brilliant TV performer in which he can write his own scripts and is original and funny, whereas the humor is very broad, very crude for Trump. He, with very, very low assets, with very low cards, I mean, given the kind of nation that he's leading, the economy that he is the head of, the war that they have been in and survived, which is a huge achievement so far, is really just beyond Trump. I think, let's put it like this, I think both in Putin, but particularly in Trump, what Zelensky does, and I think Zelensky, even now, just looking at him, hearing him, sometimes he looks very tired. I don't think he suffers from what I'm about to say so much as Trump, particularly, and Putin, and that is imposter syndrome. I would think that Vladimir Zelensky could see, I hope he can see, circumstances when things calm down a bit, that he can step out of office, that he can step down sometime between the autumn of this year and the autumn of next year. This is absolutely, this kind of thinking is absolutely alien to Trump and Putin. And I think that, yes, there is a sort of mad narcissistic jealousy in this. He's a great performer, Zelensky, that he can turn up. And that's why you get these crude and childish remarks by J.D. Vance and his offsider saying, "Why aren't you wearing a suit?" Because actually the slightly fatigue-like zip jumpers and T-shirts are absolutely the trademark, are the look. And if you're going to make, it's like the very contrived row with Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, and that was really crude performance because it was all about playing to the white majoritarians, the almost true neo-fascists in the MAGA movement, the white supremacists, and similarly the way that Trump has handled Zelensky. A few people have said, "Oh, Zelensky should have been more tactful, or he should have understood that Trump is like that." But by and large, Trump lost a lot of people in the global audience by that kind of crude, boorish, bullying behavior.
Thank you, Mr. Fox, for your time and your insightful answers, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you. Yes.
Also, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has ordered his army to create so-called security buffer zone along the border with Ukraine. Also, Russian army has begun its offensive deep inside the Sumy region. Russian sites 4 border villages in Ukrainian Sumy region. However, this advance has been halted by the resistance of the Ukrainian armed forces. What is your assessment of this Russia's war efforts in the Sumy region to create so-called buffer zone?
Well, I think the buffer zone from a Russian perspective is a movable feast. It's a creeping buffer zone. In terms of the grand strategic objective, I think that they see all of Ukraine as the buffer zone. That's certainly the sort of language which Medvedev is using at the moment. So they will always move that again. At the moment, they're seeing it as a buffer zone for the strikes that Ukraine are doing over the border. So from a tactical perspective, that would make sense from a Russian viewpoint, but let's not kid ourselves. What they mean by a buffer zone, they mean extending Russian sphere of influence all the way to the former those countries which are now part of NATO.
Also, according to Sky News, 50,000 Russian force is stationed just across the border from the city of Kharkiv. What are the chances for another full-scale attack on Ukraine, and do you feel that Russia has enough resources to conduct large-scale operations, full-scale operations, such types of operations which were conducted after the beginning of full-scale invasion of Ukraine?
Well, as I said just now, but in another context, there's always this mismatch between ends, ways, and means. If 50,000 people were an exploitation echelon with thousands of tanks and AFVs on day one of this war, you could say that might happen. But obviously, the changing character of war and the fact that the resource of maneuver has degraded of the Russians means that their ability to capture ground in a meaningful way, rather than a slugging and slow bite and hold way, means that their ability to capture ground and exploit is very caveated and very slow. As I've said a number of times, it's the chicken pecks grain by grain. And with the losses each day, 50,000 people is not something that will sustain you unless it's continuously replenished. So at some stage, they will meet the point of culmination. That is, in military terms, the culminating point is when you can go so far can go no further. And I don't think they'll be able to go much further in any of the current operations in a meaningful way. That doesn't mean they won't capture little bits of ground, but they're generally meaningless bits of ground. The odd village here and there is a tactical success, a minor tactical success. It doesn't have operational significance.
Also, according to the Washington Post, Russia's battlefield strength has started to wane, and it could run into serious shortages of manpower and weaponry until the end of this year, according to senior US and European officials and military experts. For how long Putin can continue his war against Ukraine and his war effort?
Well, I think in terms of the manpower, that is one of the choices he potentially has to make this summer. So we know that there is a sort of large amount of money being placed on getting contract soldiers. That won't sustain the manpower required at the front and to exploit further than they are currently going in a meaningful sense. In order to do that, they would have to mobilize the manpower. But then there's a mismatch between the personnel side of capability and the equipment side of capability, which is why we're seeing more and more sort of Mad Max type assaults with trying to get across the killing zone on motorbikes and all-terrain type vehicles to try and use speed as an enabler to get into the frontline positions of the Ukrainians. That again is not a way either to meaningfully do something at the operational level, nor to supply an army in a meaningful sense at the operational level.
Let's cover also recent Trump's statements toward Vladimir Putin. Trump said Sunday that Russian President Vladimir Putin has gone absolutely crazy. Do you feel that Trump is getting really frustrated about Putin's actions, and could this lead to serious decisions, sanctions against Russia, or even increased support for Ukraine?
Well, the one thing that you can say, and the word that you can always apply, I think, to President Trump is mercurial, which in English is that someone who's subject to sudden or unpredictable changes of mood or mind. Now, we've often thought for the last 3 or 4 months that the pressure strategy should be put on Russia, when often Trump has been putting a pressure strategy more on Ukraine. That is, he's rewarding the aggressor and almost at times been setting the conditions where he expects Ukraine to give such significant concessions that it would lead to a surrender peace and not a just peace. I think that Trump caveated what he said about Putin by really diluting a bit at the end, by also saying that President Zelensky was also an obstacle and a bit of a pain. So he rather diluted his message by doing that. What I do expect we'll probably see is that the Senator Graham Blumenthal axis will sponsor in the Senate a bill for this maybe 500 the tariff of 500% on those nations which are supporting Russia. The Senate, of course, is more of an independent entity than the House of Representatives, where Trump still has more sway amongst those. So I see really a kind of battle between the power of the legislature and the power of the executive in America. And this, I think, is one of those curious things where Trump quite likes Putin, because he sees him able to take action without the need to pander to anyone, in the way that in a democracy, of course, you have to take other forces into play. So what I would really hope is that a number of things happen. Firstly, there are increased sanctions, including the secondary sanctions, in the way that the 17th set of sanctions has been sort of passed by the EU. Secondly, I'd like to see the more military support, or continued military support, including long-range weapons from the Americans. And thirdly, I'd still like to see an undercutting of the Russian oil capability, not only via that sanctions and secondary sanctions package, but also by some sort of notion of absolutely degrading in economic terms the shadow fleet which is transporting the oil around the globe.
You just mentioned about long-range strikes inside Russia. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz says that Western leaders, Western countries have lifted its restrictions on use of Western-made long-range weapons by Ukraine. Can you imagine a scenario in which the US will provide Ukraine with additionally long-range weapons and would allow to actually strike inside Russia?
I can, but I would again at the moment say that that is just a scenario rather than a certainty. Like all these things on long range strike, you really have to understand a bit about how targeting works. And the targeting, when you've got very expensive smart weapons which use GPS guidance for their final terminal things, comes from satellites, space power, and most of that space power is American space power. That is why America is so crucial in the targeting sector to do these long-range strikes, and why it's necessary to keep America on side if you want to achieve that across all the panoply of the future weapon systems that will come. And indeed, there are different warheads in some of these different systems which have been already supplied. And the Taurus cruise missile from the Germans, which we haven't seen used yet and given freely by the Germans, also has a different targeting metric than some of the French and UK systems. And that could be pretty devastating, for example, on the Kerch Bridge, where it's more likely to be of greater utility than Storm Shadow or Scalp, for example.
And is it possible to conduct this targeting without the commitment, the support from the United States?
It would be pretty difficult for long-range targeting without most of the US satellite space power. If you look at the thousands of space satellites that they have, including military satellites, it outweighs anyone else in the world by a quantum level. So not to have those available would probably degrade the targeting process to a fairly significant level.
And from your perspective, do you feel that the US still provides Ukraine with this targeting information for Ukraine to conduct strikes, at least with Storm Shadow cruise missiles and French-made Scalp missiles?
Well, we know that one of the things which was taken away after the spat in the White House in February was that ability, the targeting information, the intelligence information which you need to do. A lot of that was reinstigated and given back to the Ukrainians. So what the full scope of that is would be pretty secret, I think, at the moment. But I'm sure there is some of that in train at the moment. How far the caveat would go in sort of time and space. Are they allowed to conduct operations beyond a certain line using certain American satellite systems for the final terminal guidance on that? I don't think we would know in an open forum. That would be highly sensitive information.
Also, according to Wall Street Journal, US President Donald Trump finally is considering the possibility of imposing sanctions on Russia as soon as this week. Moreover, US President Donald Trump, according to Kyiv Post, also considers to lift all Biden-era restrictions on Ukraine's long-range capabilities. What could this mean?
Well, again, a week in politics is a long time, and the legislature is on leave this week, so it's not in session. It will be in early June. So it's whether the pressures from the legislature, the Senate and House of Representatives, come together with President Trump when he's still in a mood that Putin is a kind of the bad guy. Not that that's a phrase he's ever used, but I think one thing that the Russians have done far better than the Americans have at the moment is, we have to remember that Putin is an ex-KGB guy. Every intelligence agency in the West has human factors analysts. I would guess that when Putin has any sort of meeting or dialogue with Trump, he's absolutely briefed by the human factors analysts of the best way to talk to him in a way that plays to his ego, so that it does look like that that Putin is a good guy from his perspective. Now, they would look at things, for example, like some people would say that President Trump suffers from a thing called the hubris nemesis complex. He absolutely believes, I think, in the great man theory of international relations, which is that two or three guys, because of the leaders of the country, can have a great relationship and sort out every geopolitical problem in the world. That's not really how geopolitics works. Further, his worldview is eroded by this notion that, hey, if you stop the war, you'll be able to trade with us, oh, Mr. Putin. Again, nations don't go to war for economic reasons. They are not the accountants and bookkeepers of the world. They look at power and the accumulation of power. And that's when you come back to the grand strategic objectives of Russia, which is absolutely to regain lost territory and spheres of influence. That notion, again, that Putin said many, many times, that the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century was the demise of the Soviet Union.
You just mentioned that Trump is being played by Vladimir Putin, is being manipulated. Why can't Trump's national security team prevent him from being manipulated by Putin?
Well, one of the differences between President Biden and President Trump is that President Biden was always a interagency man, that he took briefings from the interagency machinery. That is not the way I think that Trump does business. He thinks he is this sort of genius who knows everything, and therefore his ability and attention to detail and to take those detailed briefs that you need to be all informed from across the range of agencies is probably just not there in the way that it was under the Biden regime and the way it would be for Putin, I think.
You just mentioned about the intelligence briefing. I suggest it was the Washington Post reported that Donald Trump does not really like to participate in this intelligence briefings conducted by CIA and other US intelligence agencies. What could this mean, and why does he hesitate to listen to his top intelligence officials, top intelligence professionals?
Well, you have to firstly understand how the intelligence agencies work in America. So there are 18 intelligence agencies in America. The CIA is not primus inter pares for the briefing of the president. It's the ODNI, Office and Director of National Intelligence, which also has a problem because obviously the head of ODNI has also been fairly friendly to Russia in the long term. So you have sort of people who are just not used to working in those positions, don't have the technical expertise to head those agencies, which we've really seen in the past and in past presidencies. That can be a problem both in unilateral briefing and in collating the briefing of all the agencies to make sure that you don't have a slip between the cup and the lip. And that really should be the role of ODNI, primus inter pares, in briefing the president. But of course, that doesn't stop the CIA or some of the other big eight, as they call it, from having access to brief the president. But I just don't think he has that attention span and has that as his way of working.
Let's cover also preparation for the NATO summit in Hague this June. According to the American media outlets, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte tries to prevent a clash between President Zelensky and President Trump during this summit, and that's why the program of summit was shortened, and it's probably the case that President Zelensky will not participate in the main dinner of NATO leaders. However, he could be involved in the NATO forum regarding the defense spending and military industrial production. What is your expectation about this NATO summit in Hague, and do you feel that this conference could change something in Trump's stance on NATO and on Ukraine?
Well, as I said, Daniel, a week in politics is a long time. I think it's 4 weeks or thereabouts till the next NATO conference. That's absolutely really what I've been getting at, in that most international relations really work on the basis that protocols and procedures which precede any meeting are the things that set the tone and the way that the agenda and business is done. So at this range, 4 weeks out, and with the volatility of all the things that are going on with the relationship between Trump, Putin, and within NATO and President Zelensky, and I think there's still a lot to play for in the left and right of arc of what might be discussed and what might come out of that. So I think it would be absolutely premature at a month's notice to try and make any predictions of what might come out of that NATO summit.
Thank you, General Chapman, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to Ukraine, Daniel. Thank you for having me.
Heroям слава. Thank you very much.